The launch of Final Fantasy 16 is fast approaching, ladies and gentlemen, and based on everything I've seen from the marketing, the trailers, and gameplay, I honestly think it looks really damn good. Here is a sample of gameplay from the State of Play presentation. And I mean, look at it. It looks gorgeous. The combat looks freaking insane. It is not turn-based, so it's not traditional, but, you know, it's trying to evolve, and I think it's going in the right direction. And the fact that they're going back to a more sort of fantasy medieval setting, and the fact that Devil May Cry 5's lead combat guy is helming the combat in this game, and it really shows. Yoshi P is taking charge, so I think the story is going to be really compelling. If Final Fantasy XIV is anything to go by, Yoshi P led Final Fantasy XIV into great success, and him helming this game gives it a lot of credibility, and it gives fans a lot of confidence that this can turn out to be really good. And Square Enix, of course, is hoping that the game will really resonate with fans and with the gaming masses, and that it'll go on to sell well. But apparently, early signs just based on pre-orders has Square Enix, and I quote, panicking a little bit based on a report by games journalist Imran Khan here, who published the following post on Patreon where he apparently heard rumblings behind the scenes that pre-order sales for the game are not living up to Square Enix's expectations. Here's what he had to say. I had heard recently that Square Enix is panicking slightly over Final Fantasy 16 pre-order numbers, which are tracking behind Final Fantasy 15, even accounting for the lesser number of launching platforms. Do keep in mind that Final Fantasy 15 was multi-platform. It launched on PlayStation and Xbox, and eventually it came to PC. So with Final Fantasy 16, we're just talking about a PlayStation 5 launch. It is exclusive to PlayStation, so pre-order numbers for Final Fantasy 16 are bound to be worse than Final Fantasy 15 because it's less accessible. It's just going to be available on one very specific console. But according to Khan, even accounting for the fact that Final Fantasy 16 is only launching on PlayStation 5 instead of it being multi-platform, it's still doing worse than Final Fantasy 15 pre-order numbers. Now, Imran Khan does emphasize that those are pre-order numbers, and they're usually only useful to gauge guaranteed day one sales versus potential day one sales, so the actual number could blow everyone away. A lot of companies these days place a lot of importance on pre-order numbers and those guaranteed sales on day one. That's why pre-order bonuses are such a big thing now, finding ways to incentivize people to buy the game before they know for sure exactly what they're getting before the reviews come out. So this is not guaranteed indication that the game is going to sell poorly or anything like that, but at the same time, it's not an insignificant figure or an insignificant difference. It might indicate a potential trend of FF16 not selling as well as FF15, but it's all up in the air. We'll have to see if people are just holding out on pre-ordering. Perhaps the masses are becoming more privy to the fact that there's no advantage to pre-ordering other than you're giving companies money before a product has come out, before the reviews have come in, before you know for sure exactly what you're getting into. Pre-orders used to be a thing because of physical scarcity, but with video games trending more towards digital, scarcity doesn't actually exist. Unless you want like a collector's edition or a physical copy that may run out at your local store, you're doing yourself a disservice by pre-ordering, and hopefully more people are becoming privy to that and are just biding their time and waiting to see how this game turns out before pulling the trigger on purchasing this game. It's also worth noting that Final Fantasy 16 is coming out not long after other huge releases like Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, which came out recently. Diablo 4 is already out in its early access stage, and Street Fighter 6 came out recently on June 2nd. A lot of juggernauts are occupying our summer, and Final Fantasy 16 is fighting for people's time among these gargantuan releases. So it could very well be that the timing of Final Fantasy 16's launch amidst a crowded period is not doing it any favors. It's also worth noting that Final Fantasy 16 is not only exclusive to PlayStation 5, but there aren't as many PlayStation 5s out there as there were PlayStation 4s when Final Fantasy 15 came out. And all that comes in amidst less than ideal economic times where people are being a bit more picky about the purchases that they make. And so there are plenty of factors to consider. I think it ultimately makes sense that Final Fantasy 16's pre-order sales are going to be less than Final Fantasy 15's. Imran Khan wonders if Square Enix is also concerned about the sales of the upcoming Part 2 of the Final Fantasy VII Remake Trilogy. He said, I wonder if they want to remind people the next chapter of Final Fantasy VII's Remake Trilogy exists and give it more marketing time than they had planned, referring to the fact that recently, out of the blue, Final Fantasy VII's social media started started posting these developer Q&A, seemingly to remind people that this game exists, that Rebirth is happening, that it's coming in the not so distant future, and maybe just trying to keep the hype alive as people wait for this game to come out. Imran points out that while Final Fantasy VII Remake didn't sell poorly, it did drop off after launch more than Square Enix would have liked. Initial sales of Remake were quite good, but it slowed down faster than Square Enix seemed to expect, so I imagine they really want Rebirth to sell as well as possible. Well, of course they do, but I imagine they're really hoping for an uptick in sales. Final Fantasy has never sold poorly, but Square Enix has lofty expectations for that IP, and it's a matter of just exactly how high they've set expectations for Final Fantasy XVI, whether it's something unreasonable given the conditions that Final Fantasy XVI is working with, from exclusivity to all of these other games coming out at the same time that are in high demand. But look, at the end of the day, Final Fantasy is a big enough brand that when reviews do come out, if they're glowing and overwhelmingly positive, word of mouth will spread, and even if pre-order numbers aren't great, day 1, day 2, day 3 sales have the potential to be fantastic, and we've seen launches in the past where the peak number of concurrent players increased after the first day. Hell, in the case of a launch like Elden Ring, we saw player numbers go up from its launch until like a week after launch. As long as the game delivers in a big way to the point where people find it irresistible to talk about this game on social media and spread the word about how everyone should play this game, I think this game will do just fine in the long term. There are plenty of examples of major AAA releases out there that have continuously sold over the months and years after launch, but the quality really has to be there. This really has to be a game that people can't help but constantly praise. On the other hand, I'm not ruling out the possibility that Final Fantasy XVI might not sell as well as some of the previous entries. Maybe there's something about it going back to a more standard sort of fantasy medieval setting. Maybe people have gotten more used to modern Final Fantasy games leaning towards sci-fi or something contemporary mixed with fantasy elements. Or maybe the fact that the gameplay leans more towards action rather than turn-based RPG or a more RPG style combat, which Final Fantasy VII, even on some level, retains, even if it leans into action. Maybe the absence of that, the fact that the way the game plays feels so non-traditional for Final Fantasy specifically, is alienating some parts of the Final Fantasy fanbase who are maybe just waiting and seeing before ordering this game that does deviate from your traditional Final Fantasy formula of the past. I have generally noticed that the viewership of Final Fantasy XVI marketing materials on YouTube is less than that of Final Fantasy XV. So I don't know if there's generally just less interest surrounding this game, less hype compared to Final Fantasy XV. But I don't know, I personally have a good feeling about Final Fantasy XVI. It just looks really good across the board. And if the game can have a confident, successful launch, then, you know, even if pre-order sales are kind of rough right now, as the PlayStation 5 player base continues to grow with continued sales of PlayStation 5s, more people will be gravitated towards trying out Final Fantasy XVI. Now, the exclusivity for this game is timed, so it is eventually likely coming to Xbox and PC, and at that point, a new wave of people will likely join the fray. But until then, yeah, I mean, given the console that you chose to launch it exclusively for, given the time frame that you chose to launch this game on, given the price point of $70 compared to Final Fantasy XV $60, I'm personally not entirely surprised that Final Fantasy XVI pre-orders are tracking lower than Final Fantasy XV's. But at the same time, I'm not behind the scenes looking at these sales figures, and I don't know what's going on the business side of things of Square Enix. The fact that Imran uses the term slightly panicking might suggest that news is worse than I think it is, and maybe this game is just not gonna meet sales expectations. Maybe it'll not sell all that well, which, I don't know, just, it would be crazy for a Final Fantasy mainline entry to not sell well. That just doesn't compute to me, because Final Fantasy is such an iconic game series, and anytime a new Final Fantasy game launches, gamers are there to check it out, or at the very least curious enough about it to, you know, make waves. So let's see what kind of game Final Fantasy XVI delivers, whether it'll get those rave 9 to 10 out of 10 reviews. And if that ends up being the case, then yeah, I think sales will be continuous throughout the course of months and years. But yeah, just an interesting bit of development surrounding Final Fantasy XVI that I thought was worth talking about. I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on the report here that Square Enix is slightly panicking at pre-order numbers being lower than Final Fantasy XV, even accounting for the PS5 exclusivity. Do you think that Square Enix is overreacting here? Do you foresee Final Fantasy XVI not selling as well for whatever reason? And what's your general interest level for Final Fantasy 16? It's frankly one of the more exciting Final Fantasy releases in recent memory for me. But what about you? Am I sort of in the minority here, or are you also in my side of the fence? Or is there a reason that compared to past Final Fantasy entries, this one just isn't appealing to you based on what you've seen from the marketing materials? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.